Hello and welcome to this fireside chat with Dr. Jonathan Haidt from NYU. Haidt, sorry.
Haidt.
Very good to meet you, Jonathan. Thank you so much for being here. Jonathan is one of the world's renowned social psychologists, and he has done a lot of important work on social media and smartphones and its detrimental effects on children and teenagers especially. And today we're going to explore this topic from a variety of angles and see especially what can we do about it. What are solutions that our community, that schools, that policymakers can take to address this issue? Jonathan, so you've been working on this field for a long time, and so you just recently wrote a new book. Can you talk a little bit about the book and what made you write it?
Certainly. So the book is called The Anxious Generation: How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. And it was a kind of an accidental outgrowth of a side project. That is, my main research is on moral psychology, and then I've moved into political psychology. And I got very interested in what social media is doing to our institutions and our democracy. So I thought that that was my main line. But I ended up writing an article and then a book with Greg Lukianoff on what was going on in universities. Beginning around 2014, the students coming in were just really different. They were much more fragile, much more easily harmed or offended by books, words, speakers' ideas. So we wrote an essay called The Coddling of the American Mind, and that became a book in 2018. And so I was beginning to look at mental health, like why, at the time we thought these were millennials. We thought millennials went up through birth year 1999 or so. But it turns out that people born in 1996 or so are just, they begin to be different from those born before then. And the biggest difference is much higher rates of anxiety and depression and related disorders. And so I was interested in this. Why is this happening? Why is this happening? And in the Coddling of the American Mind, we thought, we had a whole chapter on overprotection. That's the coddling piece. Overprotection. We need to let kids out to play. And then we just speculated. Well, so it could also be that they're the first ones that kind of grew up with Facebook and then Instagram. So maybe social media has something to do. But we didn't know much in 2017 when we were writing it. Well, the data kept coming in year after year, and the mental health stats kept climbing higher and higher. Rates of, especially, you see it especially whenever you look at the younger teen girls, like 10 to 14 years old. For them, you tend to get more than 100% increases on self-harm, hospital visits, emergency room visits for self-harm. They're up, I think, 190%.
That's crazy.
From 2010. I always just start at 2010, so I'm not cherry-picking starting points. 2010 to 2015 is the period that I'm calling the Great Rewiring of Childhood. So we look at 2010, and then you follow that up to, say, 2020. You get these enormous increases in anxiety, depression, self-harm, and suicide. The percentage increases are larger for girls, although suicide rates are much higher for boys. So it affects both sexes, but the link to social media just is especially clear for girls. In any case, the data was piling up, and I kept thinking about this. Why is this happening? And I started from hearing not just from fellow professors with college students, but now from employers saying our new employees are just very difficult to work with. They're taking all these days off for anxiety. They are showing the same behavior as the expectation of accommodation that they had in K through university. So it was becoming more of a widespread cultural thing. And so while I set out to write a book on what social media was doing to democracy, but the part I started with, what is it doing to Gen Z, to people born after 1995, who went through puberty on social media? That's the key thing, is early puberty. They seem really different, and it just got bigger and bigger, and I realized I need to write a whole book on this. So that became The Anxious Generation.
That's really interesting and crazy, actually, thinking about these effects. Can you talk a little bit about the Great Rewiring? What really happened to children's brains in this period? Yeah. And can you provide some more statistics and data, what actually happened to mental health rates after 2010?
Yeah. So the book, I can summarize the book in two ways. The first is to say that the play-based childhood faded out between 1980 and 2010. And the second is that the phone-based childhood arrived between 2010 and 2015. That's the Great Rewiring. So there's two pieces of the puzzle. Another way to say it, to summarize it, is to say we have overprotected our children in the real world, which has gotten safer and safer since the 80s. And we have underprotected them in the virtual world, which has an ever-growing number of threats and risks. So those are the two mistakes that we've made. And so my argument is, the reason why I call it the Great Rewiring is that is that the human brain is this enormous, by far the largest, other than dolphins, but the largest relative to our body. The frontal cortex in particular takes a huge amount of input over many, many years for the neurons to wire up in the right way. That happens especially during puberty. So the brain grows very fast at first, and then it slows down. It doesn't actually grow that much anymore. And then you've got a burst of change in early puberty triggered by hormonal events. And so during that time, kids, the normal human course is they're playing, they're socializing, they're interacting, they're teasing, they're flirting, they're doing all sorts of things. That's the way it's been for millions of years. And then all of a sudden, it's, no, how about not doing that? How about you're doing this all day long? And sure, you're with your friends, but through the phone. And sure, you're doing sports, but through a video game controller. And so you take all the things that we think are part of healthy human development, you cut those all down by 80 to 100%, and then in its place, you put digital activities. That's why I'm calling it the great rewiring of childhood, taking a developmental perspective, all the things that need to happen for a person to become enculturated, make the transition from a child to an adult. All those things are really complex neural and social and meaning level dances, and it all gets disrupted once kids are doing this for most of the day.
Mm-hmm. No, that's actually very, very interesting.
Oh, now you asked for some more numbers.
Yeah.
So I've already mentioned the basic mental health stats. The thing I want to add is we actually have a lot of numbers on the Great Rewiring. Mm-hmm. And one of the biggest changes you can see in the American Time Use Survey, where they track a representative sample, what were you doing all day? And when they look at time outside of work or school, how much of that time was spent with friends? And so they have that for Americans. I think it goes down to like age 14 or 16. It's below 18. So you start in sort of mid to late teens, all the way up to 70s. How much time are you spending with friends? And the answer for most Americans is 40 to 60 minutes a day on average. Okay. Because most people are married, they have a job, they are not hanging out with their friends like on the TV show Friends. Okay. There's one exception, of course, which is young people. I mean, if you're 16 to 24, you're spending a lot of time with your friends. I mean, that's what you do, with your friends, until the Great Rewiring. The number of hours, it used to be well over 2 hours a day young people spend. So it does begin to go down in the 90s and the 2000s. So the early internet era, when we had the internet and we had web browsers, but no social media, no smartphones, we do see people spending more time on screens and digital activities. So it begins to drop in the 90s and the early 2000s. But mental health doesn't change. In fact, it gets even a little better. The millennials are not. The millennials are in good mental, or at least they certainly were, and they still are, in very good mental health conditions compared to Gen Z. So time with friends begins to drop, but then it drops more steeply once. 2012 is sort of the peak year of transformation. In 2010, 2011, I forget which data, it was only about 20% of American teens had a smartphone. They mostly had flip phones. Mm-hmm. In 2015, it was 80%, something like that. Wow. So it's that period where everything flips. And that's the period where time with friends plunges, because now kids are spending almost all their free time on their phone or video game controllers. So we do have good data that shows the complete transformation of what daily life was like. Mm-hmm. My argument is, could this have maybe affected them in lasting ways? Perhaps. Yeah,
because it's completely fundamentally different from what we've been doing, right? For
millions of years.
Millions of years. Yeah. So there are critics out there that say, oh, there's actually other reasons that lead to that mental health decline. So I'm curious, are there any other factors that could have led to this? Like, I don't know, people bring up climate change, economic downturns, although a lot of these have been around for a long time. So I'm curious kind of like how you counter that argument.
Sure. So there's two things to consider. One is, are there other factors that are harming teen mental health? Yes, there are many others. Is there any other story that can explain why it all changes on a dime in 2012? Why was it that things were pretty steady, or levels were actually going down on some measures until the late 2000s, and then in the early 2010s they go up like a hockey stick? I haven't yet found another theory. The main one that people throw at me, there's two. The main one is the global financial crisis, to which I say, okay, that was 2008, no sign of any mental health problem for the kids. Obama's second term comes, the economy is improving, and all of a sudden, the kids get depressed, especially the preteen girls. So the global financial crisis doesn't make sense. Also, Canada had very little crisis. They managed pretty well. But their girls also plunge in mental health just like ours. So do girls in Australia, New Zealand, Scandinavia. So this is a multinational collapse of mental health at the same time, in the same way, affecting girls especially. And so, people then when people say, oh, but school shootings, that's, of course they're depressed. The Newtown shooting was 2012, and after that, all these kids had their lockdown drills. Wouldn't that make any kid anxious? Okay, that sounds plausible, but why did girls in New Zealand suddenly start checking into hospitals at the same time? It doesn't make any sense. So, sure, mental health is complicated, but when you have a synchronized global collapse in mental health hitting the same way demographically, it's going to be pretty hard to find a theory other than my theory of the Great Rewiring.
No,
do you know any others? Can you think of one?
I'm curious, what roles do schools play? Because if you look at the typical school day nowadays, let's say a kindergarten or elementary school person, they are in school the entire day. They watch videos, they have computers. We didn't have that I'm a millennial. We had elementary school maybe until noon or 1, and then we could play in the afternoon. So have you looked into this, how this would affect mental health of students?
So once again, I think it's really bad that they're doing this, but that's been going on since the 90s when we started getting this idea that we need all kids to have their own computer so that they can be on a screen all day long. So I think that's bad, but it can't explain why everything turns around 2012.
Interesting.
The issue of technology in schools is a really important one. I focused on the phones. Let's make sure that kids don't have a device with them that they can stay connected, that they can text their friends all the time, even during class. If we succeed in in encouraging schools to go phone free, lock up the phone in the morning, you get it back in the afternoon. If we succeed in doing that, then the kids are still all going to have Chromebooks and tablets and laptops in school. And so many of the same problems will be there. That is, they'll be texting each other, they'll be surfing the web, they'll be watching pornography, they'll be playing video games, all the stuff that is kind of incompatible with academic achievement.
And what about the data itself? Is it mostly self-reported, or do you look at objective data? Because one could imagine that we've seen in the last couple of years, I think that people are much more aware of mental health, they report it more, they meet with mental health counselors more frequently than maybe they did 20 years ago. So what role does that play?
So the general view that I've heard is, this critical or skeptical view is, it's not a real increase, the kids are all right, it's just that they're more comfortable talking about it, they're more comfortable reporting it. And stigma has been reduced.
Right.
And of course it's good to reduce stigma, but the fact that you see the exact same curves in the self-report mental health data you see in the self-harm hospitalization data.
Okay.
So that's not self-reported
objective,
by the kids. Those are objective measures. And in 2017, there were a lot of people who said this, like, oh, it's not a real crisis, it's just differences in reporting or changing diagnostic criteria. And then in 2019, when I was really getting into this topic in a big way, I thought we were making progress, kind of showing, like, no, actually, there's actually emerging evidence for causality. And then COVID hit. And for 2 or 3 years, we couldn't think of anything else. We couldn't figure things out. We couldn't even really do research because everything's so different now. So it's not clear. Is it the screens? Is it COVID? What is it? But now that COVID has been, in the rearview mirror for about 2 years, or however you want to call it, now I think people all over the world are seeing the wreckage. Now I suddenly find wherever I go, and any journalist who interviews me, they almost always say the same thing. Before the interview, they'll say, I have 3 kids and I see it in 2 of them. So this is no longer like just some statistical anomaly. This is something that most people now see. If not in their own kids, then they see it in their friends' kids.
And I'm curious, you alluded a little bit to it, but what do smartphones and social media actually do to children's brains? And even adults, because I think the effects are not limited to teenagers, right? They're more exacerbated because their brains are developing. But I'm curious, what are the effects and what are some of the mental health illnesses that we do see increase as a result?
So let's start with adults. I assume most people listening are adults, and probably mostly adults who went through puberty with a flip phone or earlier, not with a smartphone.
Right.
And think how hard it is for you to stay on task. I don't use my phone very much because I'm always at a computer, at home or in the office. But for me, the problem is just that, whenever the thinking gets hard, whenever there's something hard, my brain says, oh, what's the weather going to be? Or oh, let's check this. And, and I am on Twitter, and I try not to check, but sometimes if I've posted something, I want to know, what is it? So I feel I get called over, I get distracted. Now, that's me on a computer. Now imagine that you're an 11, 12, 13-year-old kid, early puberty, and you're trying to do your homework on your laptop. But generally they'll have multiple screens. So if you're working on your laptop, you're also monitoring your phone. So that's one thing. You're doing that all the time. And on your phone, you posted something earlier, and now you're being told, come see what people said about the thing you posted. It's very hard to resist that.
Yeah.
So just behaviorally, you have what I've called just the fragmentation of attention. I mean, we all feel it. We all, adults, we all feel it. Imagine being a kid where you have multiple screens. They're on many platforms. Very few kids are on just one platform. So you have to check all these different platforms. And they're all designed to hook you. They're all competing with each other to spearfish your attention. The net result, what I find from talking to my students at NYU and what I find from talking to other members of Gen Z, the net effect is basically these things, they will expand like a gas to fill every available moment. In fact, they'll fill many moments that aren't available. So that if you're talking to someone, one of the heavy users, this is not true of all Gen Z, but especially the half that are the heavier users, half of them say they're online almost constantly. That's what they report. How often would you say you're online? And 45% in a Pew survey from a few years ago said almost constantly. What that means is that if you're at dinner with your kids, they're probably checking their phones. And if you force them not to, they're thinking about it. They're thinking about it. And as soon as they can, they will. So it becomes possible with the smartphone to literally check out of the real world, to have to never be present with another person, but to only be servicing your many network connections. And I would argue, just as we know that that being in solitary confinement, I mean, imagine putting a child in solitary confinement at the age of 10 and letting her out when she's 18. I mean, that would be a horrible thing to do. Now, being on social media is not the same as solitary confinement, but it does mean you're not going to spend much time with other people. Once you get the phone, you're not going to spend much time with other people.
That's crazy. I mean, that sounds extremely addictive, right? And so I'm curious, like in the real world, we don't let kids buy alcohol, we don't let them smoke. Why don't we do something similar in the virtual world where we say, okay, you have to have age verification if you want to open a social media account? Is it really because the tech companies are just pushing back against this? What is the reason that we haven't moved on this?
Yeah. So a big part is that the tech companies push hard, and they generally push, the general sticking point is that age verification would create some inconvenience for adults. So imagine you're a grown-up and you want to open an account on Instagram or TikTok.
Yeah.
At present, you just do it. It's extremely quick. You can make up 50 different names. There's no verification of anything. You can be 3 years old. You can be 90. It doesn't matter. You can, so that's the way it is. It's frictionless. The companies want everything frictionless. What I'm imagining is that just as we have state level, in this case, state level laws for buying alcohol, I think we need national level laws for privacy, trade, interstate, whatever. I'm not sure. You tell me where, how the regulation would work. But given that we already have a congressional law, COPPA, that sets the age to 13, the age at which a child can sign a contract with a company to give away her data without her parents' knowledge or consent. If you're 13, you can do that. But the way Congress made the rule is as long as the companies don't know you're under 13, they're okay. So Congress incentivized Meta to not know how old you are. Of course, they do know how old you are, but they have plausible deniability. So we set up a world, Congress accidentally, I think, set up a world in which there's no age verification. You just lie and then you're on. So that's the world we live in. What I'm hopeful is that Congress would update that law, raise the age to 16, 13 is way too young, and mandate enforcement, but not mandate how. I don't want the technological environment changes so quickly. There are now so many different companies that provide age verification for gambling and alcohol sales. There's all kinds of things on the internet, commercial activities that are limited to adults. So there are many ways to do age verification. You don't have to show a driver's license or a credit card. There's all kinds of systems. What I'd like to see is Congress would mandate that the companies have to do something. They have to make a good faith effort. We're not going to hold them responsible for 100%, but at present it's 0%. There's nothing.
Right.
So we have to rethink this idea that the internet must be entirely frictionless for everyone. And in the physical world, 150 years ago there were no protections for children, and a lot of children got mangled in the early Industrial Revolution. But eventually we said, you know what? We actually need to protect child workers. We need car seats. We need when I was growing up, there were vending machines for cigarettes, and so kids bought cigarettes. Right. We said, you know what, how about if we don't do that anymore? And that was an inconvenience for adults. What I'm arguing is that we have to realize that a completely frictionless, anonymous virtual world in which a lot of kids are getting chewed up, we have to stop that. And it's going to require a little bit of inconvenience for adults. It'll be an extra step when you sign up for accounts on platforms that take your data. There'll be limits on what kind. That's what I'm advocating.
And I think that would make sense because a lot of our lives are moving digitally, right? And you cannot expect to have a completely frictionless environment when you don't have it in the real world.
That's right.
There are regulations in place for a reason, and I think this is a very good reason, right?
So the related argument that I hear over and over, and I believe this is pushed by the platforms, is it should be the parents' responsibility. It's up to the parents. You know, the government. Who's the government to tell you how to raise your kids?
Right.
You know, parents are the ones. They should get to choose. Well, guess what? We're trying really hard, and we can't do it. Like all over the country, all over the world, we're all having the same arguments, the same fights. It's really hard to do. Imagine as an example, imagine if we said, you know, there are bars and there are casinos and there are strip clubs and there are gun ranges. There's all sorts of things. But it's really the parents' responsibility to decide whether a child goes into those. And we cannot expect bar owners or casino owners, we can't expect them to check ID at the door. That would be an inconvenience on everybody has to show their ID? That's outrageous. Yeah. No, it's up to the parents. If they don't want their kid drinking, don't let them out.
That's crazy. No one would even advocate that, right?
It's crazy, but that's the world we live in.
That's crazy. I want to talk a little bit about what you mentioned also about the focus and the attention. I think that's something I really worry about, especially when you think about these kids are going to grow up. They have to have a job. They have to hold a job. And so I used to teach at university, and just anecdotally, I really noticed over the last 10, 14 years, from 2010 to 2020, that students couldn't put their thoughts down on paper anymore. Their writing just got worse and worse. So I'm curious, have you found something like this in your data? Kind of like what do you see the effects on attention, on the ability to organize your thoughts, to structure them, to express yourselves?
That's a really good question. I don't have a direct answer for you on writing ability. I haven't seen. Now, we do know, actually, academic achievement was rising for 50 years until 2012. And then if you look both at the NAEP, which is the American, America's report card, if you both look at the NAEP and then you look at PISA, which is the global data on educational attainment, both of them show that things were going up until around 2012, and then they've been dropping since then.
Okay.
So students around the world are learning less, they're less academically advanced, because the more technology we give them, the less they're able to learn because they're using it for entertainment. They're not using it very much to learn. Yeah. These are incredibly distracting devices that we're giving to kids. They have one in their pocket, and they have sometimes a Chromebook, and a tablet on their desk in school. So I would guess that writing ability has dropped. I don't know because at NYU, I've only been teaching MBA students who are millennials for the last 12 years. But a year and a half ago, I started teaching undergrads who are wonderful, and they make a lot of progress. We work on getting their attention back. So I don't have the data set myself to see a decline in writing. But what I do hear from other professors almost universally is that they can't get a disagreement going. They can't get students to disagree with each other publicly.
That's interesting. Okay.
They can't get any kind of argument or debate. And if you grow up online, it's like you've lived your whole life on thin ice. Imagine if from the time you were 7 or 8 years old, you always lived on thin ice. You'd be super careful wherever you step because you never know when you're going to plunge to your icy death. That's kind of what life growing up on social media can be for kids, because to be publicly shamed, to say something stupid, to have a photo taken of you and someone makes a comment and it goes viral in your school, that's incredibly painful. And so, as one student said to a friend of mine, a college student, she said, "My motto is silence is safer." Wow. That's really sad.
That's very sad. And what does that mean for our democracy, for debate, right? For thinking about ideas.
That's right. Well, let's look at that. Let's look at what social media has done to democratic debate. So I'm in a debate with some political scientists who say that the filter bubble hypothesis is false. That when because the argument is social media puts us all into communities of people we agree with, and it cuts us off. And these political scientists point out that no, actually the data shows that when you look at the news sources people get, if you're online, you actually get more variety than if you're home watching cable TV. That's true. So if the filter bubble hypothesis is that you never see things from the other side, then that hypothesis is wrong.
Right.
But I've been collecting all the studies on the topic, and once you put all the studies, if you go to, actually they're all at anxiousgeneration.com/reviews. I have all these collaborative review docs. One of them is on political dysfunction. When you look at the studies that didn't look at news sources, but looked at the people that you're communicating with, then you do see the filter bubbles. So even if a conservative, let's say, they would see something from NPR, but they'd only see it because a fellow conservative said, look at this stupid thing, and they're making fun of it, And so you're all laughing at how stupid the, own the libs or whatever it is. So this is happening on both sides. My point is that the rapid shift from face-to-face interactions, for which we have millions of years of evolution, to online life, which is this bizarre, weird world we can't really tell what's what, has been, I think, really bad for democratic debate, for child development, for classroom discussion. People are much more afraid to speak up. So who does speak up?
Yeah.
Of course, there's plenty of debate on Twitter, but most people are silent. Most
And
people
it's the extremes, right? It's the extremes on the left, the extremes on the right that are driving the debate.
That's right. So in a democracy, you always have the problem that the extremes are more passionate. They're going to have a louder voice. Okay, fine. That's built into the system.
Right.
But I think what happened in the early 2010s when social media got super viral was the extremes became super empowered, as did trolls. So there have always been men, they're almost always men, who they just enjoy being a jerk. They enjoy harassing people, and they can do it anonymously. Yeah. Some of them do it not anonymously. So social media has been great for the far right, the far left, for trolls, and for Russian intelligence agents who used to have to fly here to mess with us. Now they just sit in St. Petersburg and mess with us, and make us believe crazy, awful things about each other.
Yeah, that's very depressing. When we look at other countries in the world, actually, I'm curious, you mentioned it before. So you've seen similar trends, I would assume, in a lot of developed countries, right? Yeah. Have you looked at poorer and developing nations as well, where maybe smartphones haven't proliferated as much? I'm curious, what does the data show us from around the world?
Right, well, so the difficulty is that there is no good data on mental health in most countries. So there's one data set, the GBD, the Global Burden of Disease Study, that's sometimes been used, but it turns out that that is not actually a data set. When I first saw it, how did they get mental health data from 75 countries? The answer is they didn't. Okay. They just have a set of estimates. Some regression formula, they guess what it might be. But those estimates don't even work in the United States. They fail to pick up the huge increase in mental illness and suicide in the United States. So the GBD is, I think, not useful in this. So we just don't have good data for most of the world. But what I can tell you, and this is work I've been doing with Zachary Rausch is my research assistant originally, not really my partner in doing the research and figuring this stuff out in the book. What Zach has found is that when we looked at the Anglosphere, the major Anglo countries, totally identical, same timing, same thing. Okay. Also in the Nordic countries, all 5 Nordic countries, very similar. But the little data we have in East Asia, we're not seeing the big upturns in mental illness. And also Eastern Europe, actually their mental health, the numbers have actually gone down a little bit.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so we don't know this, but what Zach is hypothesizing, what we're hypothesizing together about this is it's the kids who are rooted in community, the kids who have to go to church or synagogue, or they have to visit their grandmother, people who are rooted, they're all on phones. All over the world, young people are on phones.
Right, yeah.
But they're so rooted in the real world that they didn't get washed out to sea.
Okay.
Whereas in the freest countries, and these are the countries that used to be the happiest, that used to have the happiest kids, so the Scandinavian countries and the Anglo countries, those always have dominated. When you look at the lists of the world's happiest countries, those countries always dominate, used to. But what the latest data shows is that while there used to be a U-shaped curve of happiness where the happiest people were young adults and then the elderly, and middle-aged people were less happy, that's no longer true. And it's no longer true because the happiness of young people has plummeted all around the world. So there are definitely regional variations, but we are seeing signs that something is happening globally. So I don't know about the non-developed countries or the less developed countries, but I can say across the developed world, there's either signs or clear evidence of a youth mental health crisis.
That's crazy. And if we think about kind of like the long-term ramifications, not only for democracy, but for worker productivity, for mental health, I mean, these kids might grow up and have children of their own, right? And they probably, you don't think so?
Well, no, because marriage and sex is down, dating is down, marriage is down. AI girlfriends and boyfriends are getting better and better. So I'm being a little facetious here. Obviously, there will still be children.
Right.
But all of our expectations about family are also up in the air. There's going to be, I think, much less marriage, many fewer children, especially in developed countries.
And that's already precipitating a crisis. I mean, we see a lot of developed countries have very low birth rates, and that's probably going to accelerate this, right?
We've been something of an outlier, but I think we're going to go next. I think Gen Z, I think we all have to keep a close eye on fertility trends in Gen Z around the world and see, is it going to be a global drop or will there be regional variations?
Oh, that's very interesting. And you also brought up, I think, which is very shocking when you look at the data, that big difference between boys and girls in terms of their mental health and how social media and smartphones affect them. Can you talk a little bit about that? What is the reason for it? What trends do you observe?
So there's so much attention to girls, and I'm guilty of fomenting that because that's where the data is clearest. I can show through correlational, experimental, all kinds of studies, social media and teenage girls, especially early teens, doesn't mix, causes and is correlated with anxiety and depression.
Okay.
That story is very clear. That also explains why, for girls, here's the graph for their mental health, steady or maybe get, numbers even going down a bit, and then you get to 2012, 2013, boom. That's not the story for boys. For boys, their increase is much more gradual. There's no one elbow. There's no single turning point as there is for girls. For boys, there's some signs that things start a few years earlier. Their suicide rates are always higher than girls, but they begin to go up a little bit earlier, a little faster, a little bit earlier, like around 2008, 2009, you begin seeing some signs of mental illness problems in boys. So boys, so what Zach really helped me figure out, what we really figured out together, is that for girls, you can focus on social media in 2012 as the transformation point, roughly.
Okay.
For boys, it's a longer, slower story. And it's especially fun, here we are at Brookings. Richard Reeves is the scholar who really, I think, laid this out in his wonderful book of Boys and Men. So what I learned from Richard is that boys began withdrawing from the real world in the 70s and 80s for a variety of economic reasons, the rise of the service industry, decline of strength-based jobs. Schools have become ever more tuned to girls' needs and not boys' needs. There's less recess, more restrictions on wrestling or running around. Shop classes disappearing. So for a lot of reasons, boys have found, it's not fun, it doesn't work, we're not doing as well as the girls. I mean, they're slower developmentally, as Richard points out. So for a lot of reasons, boys are finding school and work very ungratifying. But guess what? Every year, the video games are more amazing. Every year, the porn is more amazing. Now with the goggles, it's all going to be three-dimensional, and then it'll be, with robots, it'll be, even more. So boys have been withdrawing from the real world, and they just have so much to do in the virtual world, where they get incredibly satisfying experiences without having to exert any real effort or learn anything that will help them improve their skills for real life.
So for boys, it's really kind of like more tied to video games and pornography.
Yeah,
and for girls, it's like the pressure, the peer pressure, and the bullying on social media.
That's right. Yeah, now boys get it too. I mean, everyone hates being mobbed or gossiped
Right,
about.
of course.
So I'm not saying it's harmless, but the evidence linking social media and mental health problems for girls is just much stronger consistently across all the different kinds of data you want to look at. So that's why I focus there. But for boys, it's a different story. So I don't want to neglect the boys. The boys are doing very, very badly. But it's not that they're mostly anxious and depressed. They're not mostly anxious and depressed. But they are blocked in the normal developmental pathway to manhood.
And when you look at the different social media platforms, are there differences in terms of the damaging effects? If you look at TikTok, for instance, right, I mean, apart from the fact that it's tied to one of our autocratic enemies, the very short videos is a very different experience than maybe looking at an educational video on YouTube or connecting with friends on Facebook or Instagram. So what are the different effects, and are there differences between those sites?
Big differences between them. There's a lot of engineering differences between them. Once Facebook pioneered the advertising-based revenue model, that really put them in a race to grab eyeballs.
Okay.
And so that's why they then move on to using algorithms to get the news feed originally without algorithms on Facebook and Twitter. But they moved to algorithms to make it more engaging. So there's a lot of that going on. But I think the key thing that I would want listeners to focus on here is the short form video versus all other kinds of video.
Oh, okay.
So just an example I do with my students, or I do it now in every audience, is I ask people, how many of you watch Netflix at least once a week? And almost all hands go up. And then I say, how many of you wish Netflix was never invented? Nobody. So, because stories are good. Movies are good.
Right.
Fiction is good. The whole humans have been raised in stories forever. As soon as we could speak, we started telling stories. So stories are fine. And the stories on Netflix are so much better than when I was a kid. I mean, I watched like I Dream of Jeannie or Lost in Space with my kids. This is so stupid, they said. I had to, you're right, this is really stupid. And television shows today are much higher quality. But then I say, okay, how many of you are on TikTok? TikTok or YouTube Shorts or Instagram, or any of the short form that copy TikTok. Almost all hands go up. How many of you wish it was never invented? How many of you think the world would be a better place if these things just didn't exist? Almost all hands go up.
Oh, wow.
So this is a social trap. I ask them, so okay, this is bad for you, you're wasting time, you can see that it's degrading, you feel dirty afterwards, some of you. Why don't you get off? And the answer is always the same. I can't because everyone else is on. And everyone else is going to be talking about this TikTok that they saw yesterday, and I need to know what that was. So this is a social, this is a collective action problem. It's a social dilemma. It's trapped an entire generation. It's trapped their parents. We all feel like we have to give our kids a smartphone in 6th grade because everyone else has one. We have to let them on Snapchat and Instagram in 6th grade because everyone else did. And the kids themselves, the young people themselves, that's one of the remarkable things. They're not pushing back. Gen Z is not saying, no, don't take away our phones, don't limit our access, don't raise the age to 16. They're not saying that.
That's interesting.
They're saying, yeah, help us.
So they really need help. So let's turn to that a little bit.
To push back. There are a whole bunch of organizations designed it for us. There's a whole bunch. We list at anxiousgeneration.com. We have our aligned organizations. Gen Z, they're now really taking action on this because they see what it's done to their generation.
So what are some of the efforts? I'm curious to hear solutions now, right? Like, and so you talk about solutions, how we can try to address this collective action problem. What are some of the things that stakeholders can do?
So, so I think we can get a huge amount of bang for the buck. We can accomplish a lot with 4 simple norms, all of which are doable. To break up the collective action problems, what I propose at the end of the book in the last quarter of The Anxious Generation is 4 norms. The first norm is no smartphone before high school. So just give them a flip phone. That's what the millennials had. That's okay. So no smartphone before high school. In Britain and Spain, I've just learned, because they break things up differently, at 16 they have a change of school. So if you're listening in Europe, I would urge you to consider the norm should actually be at the end of what they call secondary school, more like around age 16. Oh. So no smartphone before high school. We've got to get them out of middle school for sure. The second norm is no social media till 16. We've got to let kids get most of the way through puberty before we immerse them in this, because it's gonna really change their social development. So let the brain at least get halfway through puberty before immersing them in that. The third is phone-free schools. And as we were saying, the distraction effects of these are so enormous that when a kid has their own private device, whether it's their phone or their Chromebook, whatever it is, if they can text other kids, they will be texting. They do text during class. They don't pay as much attention to their teacher, and they don't pay attention to the kid next to them. They're totally on their screen while the teacher is talking. So phone-free schools is a must. And that doesn't just mean in class time. This is really important. Okay. Most schools ban using a phone during class. They say you have to hide it if you want to use it. But they say, but as soon as class is over, between classes, you can be doing this so that you don't ever see anyone next to you. And at lunch, you can be doing this. So it has to be you arrive at school, you put your phone in a phone locker or a Yonder pouch. You have the whole day to listen to the teacher and to other students. You look at each other, you play together at recess. And at the end of the day, you get your phone back. We have to give kids 6 hours a day when they're not texting, their parents aren't texting them, they're not surfing the web and playing video games. So that's phone-free schools. And the fourth one is the hardest. It's far more independence, free play, and responsibility in the real world. If we're going to reduce screen time by a lot, and I think we have to, then we have to give kids back access to fun, engaging real-world activities like hanging out with other kids. And we lost our trust in them. We feel like, oh, if I ever let my 8 or 9-year-old out, they'll be abducted, they'll be hit by a car, they won't know how to cross the street. When almost all of us learned how to cross streets at 6 or 7. I mean, that was the norm everywhere, was by 2nd grade, certainly by 3rd grade, everyone's out. You go out in the afternoon, you come back at dinner, there's no adult supervision. That's how you learn the skills of democratic participation. You learn how to, let's agree, let's compromise, let's do this. Okay, what are the rules? Oh, you broke the rules. No, I didn't. All those good things that you learn when kids are together unsupervised, we've washed all that out. We have to give that back.
So there's a lot to unpack here. Let's talk about different stakeholders and some of the obstacles, right? I've heard from parents, for instance, that some parents don't want their kids to put the phone away because then they can reach them, which I think is crazy, because why not? The kids should have their time, I think, in school. They don't need to talk to their parents.
Homeschool your kid.
So how do you overcome some of those obstacles from the parent side, for instance?
Yeah.
I'm curious.
Well, so I don't want to belittle their concerns. We have shifted since the 90s towards what's called paranoid parenting. And this was coined by British sociologists because the same thing happened in Britain and Canada.
Okay.
So even though they didn't have our crime wave that we had in the 60s and 70s and 80s, just something about modernity, rising wealth, smaller families, whatever it is, something is making us invest more in child rearing as a competitive sport, especially in the Anglo countries. There's competition for top universities. So we've changed what we think of child rearing is, and it's like a project that the parents are focused on and getting the best outcome, which means academic outcomes, not emotional or mental health outcomes, but academic outcomes. You know, high SAT score, get into a good college. Obviously, there's huge class differences here, but this is sort of what even middle class. It's not just the top 10% that are focused this way. It's much or most of the country. So, what I'm hopeful is that if we can get the word out about what's happened to young people, what we're doing to them, how they're so miserably unhappy, how they're cutting themselves, they're killing themselves. They say they feel useless. This is one of the most, this is some of the saddest things that, anyway, if a graph can be sad, it's the graphs of, not just of anxiety and depression, but on the Monitoring the Future study, there's all kinds of statements, and kids are supposed to say how much they agree with them. And one of them is, sometimes I think I'm no good at all. And that was very low until about 2012, and then it goes way up.
Oh, that's great.
And one is, I feel that my life is useless. Very low until 2012, and then it goes way up. So, our kids are really suffering, and I'm hopeful that if parents can appreciate this, and come around to the view that, you know what, we can't keep doing what we're doing. We have to give them back a human childhood, and a childhood spent on a screen is not a human childhood. We adults, we can do this, all day long, and we're not happy about it, but it doesn't retroactively change our brains during puberty. And then, but the thing about having parents let go is they have to do it together. Because if you're the only one who's letting your kid out, you're going to be really scared. And as we just heard in our lunch discussion earlier, your kid might be stopped by the police because no one's ever seen a kid unsupervised since the 90s. So people still call the police if they see a child outside. And that's something you can't change as a single family, but a school can change it. And my most powerful suggestion on this comes from my work with Lenore Skenazy, who wrote the book Free Range Kids. We founded an organization called Let Grow. So parents, if you go to letgrow.org, we have all kinds of ideas for how you can give your kids back a healthier childhood. And the most powerful one of all is one that the school needs to do. It's called the Let Grow experience.
Okay.
And what it is the school, let's imagine a third grade class. The school has a homework assignment. The assignment is, go home, here's a sheet of paper, take this home. It says, go home, talk to your parents, pick something that you think you can do that you've never done by yourself. Maybe it's walk the dog. Maybe you've never walked the dog by yourself. Maybe it's, go walk 3 blocks to buy groceries or to buy ice cream, anything. Maybe it's make dinner. So something that, make your own lunch, something that you think you can do, you've never done. You go home, you agree with your parents, and then you do it. And you do this once a month for 6 months. So imagine the effects this is going to have. So you have a community of American families where everyone's afraid to let their kid out, and basically the norm is you let your kid out around age 10, 11, 12 is when we let them out without adult supervision. Of course, 12 used to be when you can start babysitting, but right. So 10, 11, 12 kids go out. So, but imagine that you have a town in which you suddenly have all these 8-year-old kids walking 3 blocks to a store to buy a quart of milk and walking home. The parents wouldn't let the kid do that on their own, but it's a homework assignment and everyone else is doing it, so okay. And then they let them go, and I've heard from a lot of parents, and they say they were so nervous, they were so afraid the first time they did it. And sometimes they followed the kid from a distance because they wanted to make sure, can she really make it? Can she get there? And then when the kid comes home, she's usually jumping up and down with excitement. They just visibly grow. So, so if a school assigns the Let Grow experience, now you have a whole town where kids are out doing things. And that changes all of the adults who see, oh, actually, my kid is not this crazy incompetent thing so different from me when I was her age. Like, actually, she can cross the street and she can pay and get change. And so you get, again, you solve a collective action problem. If you're one family sending your kid out, you can get arrested. But if you're a lot of families doing it, you change the norms in your town.
So we really have to relearn what we used to do, right? 20 or 30 years ago. There was not even a debate.
That's right, and that's why just recently I did a I did an Instagram Live, which I've never done before, with Maria Shriver.
Oh, yeah,
and she asked me, what can grandparents do? And I gave her some weak answer. And then she pointed out, because grandparents, they had this free-range childhood. Like what we worked out in our conversation was, whoa, Gen Z is now beginning to have kids. Gen Z is 28 and under.
Yeah.
So from now on, kids are going to be born to parents who never got to play outside on their own.
Oh, wow.
So how are they going to do this?
Yeah.
But the grandparents remember what it was like. They remember the before time, as you might say. So I think grandparents have a really important role to play as the human memory of what childhood was like before the internet.
And so this was the parents, but let's talk about another stakeholder, which I think is even more of a problem when we look at tech companies, right? Because obviously tech companies and social media companies, they are the ones that are trying to hook people on the phones. They're trying to get their attention. They've been pushing back against any type of regulations. So how can we compel those to change their ways and at least protect our children, right? If someone is 18 or 19 wants to spend 10 hours a day on social media, we can't prevent that. But if it's children, what are some ways we can change that? Because they're very powerful. They spend a lot of money.
Yeah. So first, we say the tech industry, but that includes thousands and thousands of companies, most of which are doing amazing work and not harming our children.
That's fair.
So I'm hopeful that the tech industry will realize they have a terrible reputation problem. People think they're destroying a generation, and most of them are innocent. So I hope that there will be some self-policing within the Silicon Valley and the West Coast to say, you know what, like, why are we doing this? Like, why a few bad actors are giving us all a really bad name. That's the first thing. I'm not counting on that to change business models. The most important thing that these companies can do, the 3 or 4 big ones especially, Meta, Snap, TikTok, the ones that have huge reach among middle school kids especially.
Right.
I'm not counting on them to suddenly enforce the rules and kick off 10, 11, 12-year-old users. So there are 2 other ways to pressure them. One is lawsuits, and I'm hopeful that these lawsuits will succeed. There's a lawsuit by attorneys general. There's a lawsuit by parents. There are lawsuits by school districts. So those are working their way through courts. I'm really hopeful those will succeed because I think these will be so much larger than the tobacco settlement. I mean, the reach. Tobacco, when I was in high school, kids smoked. At the peak of teen smoking, I found it was 1997, it was like 37% of teens smoked.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Which meant that the great majority didn't smoke.
Yeah.
Whereas social media, we're not talking, and we're talking like, high school seniors or smoking,
right,
it's not middle school kids. But with social media, they're almost all on, and even in middle school. So the companies are hooking much younger users, and they're hooking all of them rather than just a third. So I think that the legal liabilities here could be enormous, and that would be pressure to change, especially on underage users. And then the third source of pressure is regulation, congressional and state laws. And Congress is close to passing. So this is one of the amazing and inspiring things. Almost all these things are bipartisan. This is one of the few areas in our national life where we don't have a left-right difference. So COSA, the Kids Online Safety Act, it has Republican and Democratic sponsors in the Senate. That would require tech companies to treat children differently, to respect their privacy more, so COSA does a lot of good things for, if they're going to be spending 10 hours a day online, at least let's make it a better 10 hours a day. But what really will be the game changer is age verification, which would make it possible to basically get, especially the social media sites, out of middle school. Like, we've got to get this all out of middle schoolers' lives. So if you give parents the ability to delay until 16, that's one of the norms I'm urging, that would be a complete game changer. And that, I believe, if we could do phone-free schools and raise the age to 16 and require the companies to enforce it, that would be such a game changer that I believe we would see the rates of mental illness begin to come down very quickly after that.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, Florida and Utah, a number of states are leading on the state level in trying to protect their kids from social media. Congress, we don't have much hopes for them in general, but here, especially on COSA, which I think is close to, really has a lot of support, I think Congress could act. And if it acts even once, remember, Congress set up this problem in 1998 when they mandated, or they said, you have to be 13. Your users have to be 13 before you can take their data without their parents' permission. But you don't, but as long as you don't know, you're okay. When Congress said that, they created the problem. How much have they done since then to protect kids online? 0.0, nothing, not a single anything since 1998. So I hope that people, if you're listening, I hope you'll put pressure, encourage your Congress people to actually undo the mistake. And it's help us parents make the decisions that we can't even make now, because unless we lock our kids in a room with no internet, we can't keep them off of these sites.
But that's kind of shocking, right? Like since 1998, I mean, we've had so many developments that there's no movement. At least it's encouraging that it looks like there's some movement now. So let's hope that we're moving in the right direction there. Yeah, another question I had is, oftentimes people bring up, look, we have technology which is good. It helps our lives, it enriches our lives. How can we find the balance, especially in schools, between harnessing the benefits of technology and like making sure we don't have too many damaging effects on children? So what's the balance and how do we find that?
So the first thing is we have to have good data on what technology helps, what technology hurts. And I haven't done the research here. It's a whole big topic. But I did come across a report from UNESCO about a year ago that reviewed the literature, and at least the report said that there's no real evidence that this technology is helping.
So that's ed technology in schools, basically?
Ed tech,
okay,
that's
ed
right.
tech, okay.
Ed tech. So if you imagine, do you want your kid going to school where they use paper and pencil and there's a chalkboard, the teacher talks, and there's no screens?
Yeah.
Or do you want your kids going to a school where everything's on the electronic board and they have an iPad and a laptop and lots of stuff? And which school do you want? And the fact that the people who made the technology picked the first.
Yeah.
They send their kids to the Waldorf school, which has zero technology. They don't let their kids have, a lot of them don't let their kids have this stuff. So that right there should tell us probably all the educational technology is on net bad. That's the first thing. Second thing is when we look at test scores, as I said, whether we look at NAEP or PISA, the fact that test scores are going down since 2012, kids are learning less since 2012. So as we stuff them full of technology and distraction, they learn less. It's not a surprise. So when you ask how can we get the balance, I would say let's start by getting good data and summarizing all the data, and then probably the default should be let's rip everything out, especially in K through 8. Rip everything out and then see what adds in. Of course, I want this to be done experimentally, not nationally, all of us.
Of course.
We don't know what effect things will be. But I hope that there will be experiments. Oh, and just, for example, so for listeners, just before this, we had a lunch, we had a lovely lunch with a bunch of fellows from Brookings, and it was a very spirited discussion in which one man who had been involved in bringing educational technology and the internet to schools nationally, was defending the value of things like Khan Academy, and I was saying, if you could have like a laptop or an iPad that just had Khan Academy, they couldn't text, they couldn't get to the internet, just Khan Academy. And you had that at everyone's desk. And the teacher would teach and teach and teach. And then she could say, now, for the next 10 minutes, please go to the Khan Academy, and whatever, so that you get individualized. That would be great. And then it occurred to me by the end of the talk, wait, that's possible. So if anybody out there has contacts at Apple or Google or any place where you could come up with a device that only does Khan Academy, the kids, they can't get around it. It's just Khan Academy.
Yeah.
Then let's try that experimentally.
Right.
Try some schools where half they have all the technology, half they have just Khan Academy, and I think pretty quickly in a few years we would learn which pieces of ed tech will work and which ones, especially coming on top of all the other distractions, which ones are just more distraction.
And I think that's the key here, right? It's really the key to look at the data, because I don't think we know. And what I sometimes see in the debates is everyone assumes automatically that going to the tech is the good thing.
Yeah.
That replacing the pencil and paper with a laptop is better. And I don't think the data is there, or at least we haven't tested it, right?
Well, I would say that on its face, the data seems to point away from that.
Okay,
that is,
so it's even the opposite.
Again, here it's just correlation, not causation.
Of course, yeah.
But the fact that as we've stuffed in more ed tech, test scores go down, mental illness goes up, and loneliness at school. This is another thing I didn't mention before. So the PISA data set, the International Assessment of Academic Progress, a friend in New Zealand pointed out to me about 5 years ago, hey, in PISA, they have 6 questions that are about loneliness at school, about whether you make friends, whether you feel lonely. So embedded in this huge survey of academic progress, family life, socioeconomic, like all this data, they have 6 questions with things like, I feel lonely at school. How often do you agree with that? And guess what? Those questions go up all around the world after 2012. So they're steady from 2002 in the data set all the way to 2012, and then in the 2 assessments after that, they go up and up all over the world except East Asia. And so I would say that on its face, the move to heavy ed tech is at least correlated with a decline in academic learning, a decline in mental health, a rise in suicide, and a decline in a sense of inclusion, belonging, or friendship at school. So on its face, I think the null hypothesis should be, giving kids constant distraction is probably bad for them. Like that should be like our default assumption. And now, prove that wrong.
Because we have a lot of experience in the pen and paper, right, over the last centuries, and we know what works, at least in that regard, right? And so then another question I had is when we look, you mentioned, which is interesting, that students seem to be learning less or like doing less. And I think sometimes it also seems that students just know less when they come out, right? Their critical thinking ability, when you have complex issues where there's not like one side and you have to grapple with that. What have you seen in the data there? And like, how does that affect our ability to function as a democratic society versus an autocratic society, for instance?
So I haven't seen data that would directly bear on that. What I can say is there's a paper by a Finnish researcher who makes a very good point. So I don't know the data on like if you could do like pure attention span in the lab. I don't know that it's gotten shorter. But if you give kids a task, it's gotten shorter because they have multiple screens. They're always going. So young people don't have practice thinking about something for 2 minutes at a time. Like it's rare that they go 2 minutes without a distraction. They get so many notifications, so many screens open. There's what's her name? There's a wonderful researcher at I think it's UC Irvine who studies like interruptions. She's work habits. She's pointed out, I forget her exact numbers, but it's something like in the 90s when she first started this, the average amount of time that a knowledge worker would spend on a task like Word or browser or whatever, like switching from screen to screen on their computer, the average time was like 2.5 minutes, and then it's gotten shorter and shorter ever since, and that's for adults.
Oh wow!
And so I think the same thing is happening for kids. So I think that we are getting compromised executive function, ability to focus on something, plan, and then carry it through. And of course, huge implications for democratic debate, because the more we have discussions with each other where we get to see the person as a human being with whom we can compromise, that's how Congress was supposed to work.
Right.
And Congress people are generally pretty socially skilled people. They used to make friends and their families knew each other. And in the 90s, that kind of all got ripped out. Some people blame Newt Gingrich for that. That's what I've heard, that his change of this calendar, he encouraged the freshman Republicans to not move to Washington. And he compressed the schedule so they only meet midweek. So the more we rip out human relations and we put everything, let's have all democratic debate happen within the Roman Colosseum. Let's have it all happen on Twitter or social media, where people who don't know each other come together briefly to throw things at each other, and the fans cheer. And the more the fans cheer, the more that player will come back on. Like that, I think, is a recipe for disaster for a democracy, especially given if you read Federalist 10, you read what Madison thought, what he feared about the passions of people and why direct democracy fails. I mean, he was very careful that we not have direct democracy, that the people have to have the power to vote them out, to get rid of their leaders. But the people are so easily roused by demagogues. You don't want the legislators to be super responsive to what they're feeling today.
Just in that moment, right?
And now, it's been caught on film. Congress people or senators, they'll stand up, they'll make a bombastic speech, and as they sit down, they're looking at how it played on Twitter. This is a really, really bad thing for a fragile and injured democracy.
And that feeds directly to my last question, maybe kind of like to conclude the fireside chat, which is that we are at the cusp of a revolution with artificial intelligence, right? Across fields, across industries, across all parts of our lives. And it really concerns me when you try to combine social media with AI that is much more sophisticated in devising algorithms to get us hooked more closely on these devices. So how do you see the future playing out here? Where even like mundane tasks are being replaced now by automated machines or by automated systems. So what's your take on that?
So I'm very alarmed. Not surprisingly, if you've been listening to me for the last 45 minutes, you're probably not surprised that I'm very alarmed. I have an Atlantic article with Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, in which about a year ago, so after everyone was getting into ChatGPT and people were wondering, is it going to become conscious and wipe us all out? And we said, okay, let's set aside the existential concerns. Let's put aside, what is AI going to do if it becomes conscious? Let's just look at what is AI going to do to social media as we have it now?
Yeah.
And the answer is, it'll make it effortless to generate an infinite amount of garbage. So the Russian tactic that Jonathan Rauch has talked a lot about, the fire hose of disinformation. It used to be you had to have some special skills to make up an entire story about somebody saying something. Now you just type it out and you'll get a video of the person saying it in their voice. Yeah. So the amount of fakery, the amount of what was the famous quote from Steve Bannon? I forget what the prompt was. How do we win? I forget what the prompt was, but what his answer was: flood the zone with shit. And so the amount of shit that everyone can generate is it's orders of magnitude more this year than it was a few years ago, and it'll be orders of magnitude more in a year or two. Yeah. So that's going to be very, very hard. There was just an article about deep fakes about kids in the town that I was born in, Westfield, New Jersey. The high school boys they can make porno videos out of the girls in the class because you just ask AI to give them a porn body, and then you have photos and videos. So we're going to be immersed in just immersed in stuff that's going to be very bad for mental health, very bad for democracy. And things are changing so fast. We're on this inflection point. Some people call it the singularity. Mm-hmm. There's what Tristan Harris has called the complexity gap. The complexity of the things we're dealing with is getting so vast, and the speed at which it's changing is accelerating. Yet our ability to understand things is still limited by our brains and our institutions. And even if it's grown a little, it can't grow exponentially. So we are now so far out of our league in being able to even understand what's happening to us. That, I think, bodes very, very badly for the future. As an academic, I can say that, give us a question about media and health, and then give us 30 years, and we maybe will decide something, but we're not going to do it in 10 or 20. Yeah. We're going to argue about it for 10 or 20 years. So I don't know that we can keep up with this.
And that's not fast enough. I mean, if you take that long for...
That's right.
Well, this was really refreshing, a little depressing, but I think at least we have solutions. If we pursue them, we could really make a difference.
Yes, the democracy stuff I think is frightful and hard, but reducing rates of mental illness in kids, we can do it, and we can do it this year. All four of the things I said, we can do them this year, and they cost nothing, other than the cost of phone lockers. So I hope that at least people, I imagine I've depressed you about the future of our democracy, but I hope I've inspired parents in particular who are wrestling with this, and most of us are. I hope I've inspired parents that if you just work with other parents and the school, just don't do it alone, work with other parents, your friends' kids, your kids' friends' parents, and the school, you can make enormous change this year. We can end phones in school this year. We can change the norms about middle school kids having smartphones this year.
And I think that's a really optimistic and uplifting message, actually. Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Thank you, Sanjay.
Thank you.